Module 2, the 19th Century Philippines. Lesson 1, Philippine Political Condition. The objectives of this lesson are: illustrate the political structure of the Philippines during the 19th century, relate the political system during the 19th century Philippines with the present, analyze the implications of the political structure of the Philippines during the 19th century. Guide questions. How did the Spaniards govern the Philippines during the 19th century? How did the natives respond to the Spanish colonial government? Spanish rule was imposed in the Philippines by conquest. Miguel Lopez de Legazpi established the first Spanish settlement in 1565 in Cebu. Before the conquest, the Filipinos had their own indigenous culture and their own government, the barangay, headed by a native chieftain called Datu, independent of each other, and each had its own laws. The people knew how to read and write and had the beginnings of a native literature and a native art, despite being primitive, but it was in the process of normal development. The Spanish conquerors forced them to adopt foreign ways and Spanish Catholicism that they never understood. They lost their ancestral lands in the conquistadores by the encomienda system. Changes in the form of government and laws took place. The Philippines became a colony of Spain and she belonged to the King of Spain. From the beginning of Spanish rule up to 1821, the Philippines was administered by the Mexican viceroy in the name of the Spanish king. After Mexico gained her independence from Spain in 1821, the Philippines was directly ruled from Madrid. Structure of the colonial government. The Spaniards ruled the Philippines indirectly through the Viceroy of Mexico. Since the Spanish monarchy was able to colonize the big part of the world, they assigned an officer who will monitor the colony, and it is the Viceroy in Mexico. The capital of the colonial administration of Spain is Mexico. They also have the Consejo de Indias, or the legislative body for the colonies, and in 1681 the Consejo was able to release the Recapitulación de Leyes de los Reinos de las Indias. This law guided the administration of the colonies of the Spanish Empire. The Consejo de Indias appoints the Governor-General in the colonies. The Governor-General is the highest Spanish leader in the colonies. He has the power of complace, or the power to choose law that he will implement in the country where he was assigned. He also assigned taxes, the head of the military, and the royal audiencia. He also had the power to give pardon for the prisoners and to decide in different issues in the country. The Governor-General had the salary of 40,000 pesos per annum. The archipelago is divided into different provinces under the leadership of the Alcalde Mayor. The power is the same as the Gobernador General, but the jurisdiction is only in the province and had a salary of 1,500 per annum. The provinces are still divided into towns or pueblo under the leadership of the Gobernador Silio. His power and responsibilities are the same as the Alcalde Mayor. However, it is limited only in the town, and aside from that, he had the power of indulto de comercio, or the right to engage into trading. The pueblo, or the town, is again divided into different barangays headed by the cabeza de barangay. The cabeza had the responsibility to collect taxes, and he is exempted in polo y servicios. The Indios, or the natives, had no right to occupy the higher position in the government. They are only allowed to run for Gobernador Silio and Cabeza de Barangay. Suffrage is given to males 23 years old and above, well educated, and had properties and tax amounting to 500 pesos. The power and responsibilities of the Governor-General in the country is checked by the residencia or the official who check the abuse of power of the royal officials who lives in the country, and the visitador or the official who will just visit the country to check the royal officials. Political situation and abuses. Supremacy of the friars. The different religious orders had a great contribution in the establishment of Spanish colonial government in the country. For this reason, the monastic supremacy or phylocracia exists in the country during the Spanish colonization. They could influence the governor-general, in effect became the rulers of the municipalities, and control the different aspects of the society like the education, the trading, the haciendas, and the economy. The regular priests, that is, Spanish priests, were able to dominate the control in different parishes and had the power to get the parishes from the secular, that is, the Filipino priest. The enemy of the church will be considered as the enemy of the government, and this matter is proven in the case of the Gomburza and Jose P. Rizal. Abuses of the Spanish officials. The excessive powers and privileges of the Governor-General made him weak and undisciplined. His prerogative often gave him the opportunity to reward his favorites and relatives, and to penalize those who had displeased him. He oftentimes lacked the moral strength to resist corruption for material advancement. He filled in some positions in the government from the highest bidder, thus many officials exploited their offices to recover their expenses and to enrich themselves. The provincial government, where the alcalde mayor was the administrator, judge, military commander, was the most corrupt branch of the government. He controlled the provincial trade. He bought the people's rice and other products at low prices and sold them back to the natives at high prices. Moreover, he collected all the products to complete his needed quota even in time of poor harvest or crops failure, thus leaving the farmers with no seeds for next planting. More taxes were collected than required by law and pocketed the excess collections. Instability of colonial administration. The political instability in Spain adversely affected Philippine affairs because it brought about frequent periodic shifts in colonial policies and a periodic rigodon of colonial officials. For instance, from 1849 to 1898, the Philippines was ruled by 45 governor-generals, each serving an average term of only 1 year and 3 months. At one time, from December 1853 to November 1854, a period of less than a year, there were 4 governor-generals. The frequent change of colonial officials hampered the political and economic development of the Philippines. Hardly had one governor-general begun his administration when he was soon replaced by his successor. Naturally, no chief executive, no matter how able and energetic he was, could accomplish much for the colony. Corrupt Spanish officials. The colonial officials, governor-general, judges, provincial executives, etc., sent by Spain in the Philippines in the 19th century were a far cry from the able and dedicated predecessors of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. They were highly corrupt, incompetent, and cruel. Apparently, they symbolized the decadent Spain of the 19th century. General Rafael de Escuerdo, 1861 to 1873, a boastful and ruthless governor-general aroused the anger of the Filipinos by executing the innocent fathers Mariano Gomez, Jose Burgos, and Jacinto Zamora, the martyrs of 1872. His successor, Admiral Jose Malcampo, 1874 to 77, a good Moro fighter but was an inept and weak administrator. General Fernando Primo de Rivera, Governor-General for 2 terms, 1880 to 1883 and 1897 to 1898, enriched himself by accepting bribes from gambling casinos in Manila, which he scandalously permitted to operate. General Valeriano Weyler, 1888 to 1891, a cruel and corrupt governor-general of Hispanic German ancestry, arrived in Manila a poor man and returned to Spain a millionaire. He received huge bribes and gifts of diamonds for his wife from wealthy Chinese who evaded the anti-Chinese law. The Filipinos scornfully called him tyrant because of his brutal persecution of the Calamba tenants, particularly the family of Dr. Rizal. The Cubans contemptuously cursed him as the butcher because of his ruthless reconcentration policy during his brief governorship in Cuba in 1896, causing the death of thousands of Cubans. General Camilo de la Polavieja, 1896 to 1897, an able militarist but heartless governor-general, was widely detested by the Filipino people for executing Dr. Jose Rizal. Philippine representation in the Spanish Cortes. The first period of Philippine representation in the Spanish Cortes, 1810 to 1813, was fruitful with the beneficent results for the welfare of the colony. However, the second period of representation, 1820 to 1823, and the third period, 1834 to 1837, were less fruitful in parliamentary work. Unfortunately, the representation of the overseas colonies, including the Philippines, in the Spanish Cortes was abolished in 1837. Since then, Philippine conditions worsened because there was no means by which the Filipino people could expose the anomalies perpetrated by the colonial officials. Many Filipino patriots valiantly pleaded for the restoration of the Philippine representation in the Cortes. Spain ignored the fervent plea of Graciano Lopez Haina and his compatriots. Their grievance was embittered by the fact that Cuba and Puerto Rico were granted representation in the Cortes by the Spanish Constitution of 1876. Until the end of Spanish rule in 1898, Philippine representation in the Cortes was never restored. Human rights denied to the natives. Since the adaptation of the Spanish Constitution of 1812 and other constitutions, the people of Spain enjoyed freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, and other human rights. The Spanish authorities who cherished these human rights or constitutional liberties in Spain denied them in the Filipinos in Asia. No equality before the law. The Spanish missionaries who introduced Christianity in the Philippines as early as in the 16th century taught that all men, irrespective of color and race, are children of God, and as such they are brothers, equal before God. In practice, the Spanish colonial authorities, who were Christians, did not implement Christ's precepts of the brotherhood of all men, especially during the last decades of Hispanic rule. They arrogantly regarded the brown-skinned Filipinos as inferior beings, not their Christian brothers, to be protected, but rather as their subjects to be exploited. The Filipinos were abused, brutalized, persecuted, and slandered by the Spanish masters. They could not appeal to the law for justice because the law being dispensed by the Spaniards was only for the white Spaniards. Maladministration of justice. The courts of justice in the Philippines during Rizal's time were notoriously corrupt. They were courts of injustice as far as the brown Filipinos were concerned. The Spanish judges, fiscals, prosecuting attorneys, and other court officials were inept, venial, and oftentimes ignorant of law. Justice was costly, partial, and slow. Poor Filipinos had no access to the courts because they could not afford the heavy expenses of litigation. To the Filipino masses, litigation in court was a calamity. The expenses incurred even in the simple lawsuit often exceeded the value of the property at issue, so that in many instances the litigants found themselves impoverished at the end of the long tussle. Criminal cases dragged on for many years, during which period either the delinquents took to fight or the documents were lost. Dr. Rizal and his family were victims of Spanish injustice, twice, first in 1871 and second in 1891. Doña Teodora, Rizal's mother, was unjustly arrested and jailed on flimsy grounds. Rizal himself was deported on July 1892 to the Pitan without benefit of a trial. His brother Pasiano and his brothers-in-law were exiled to various parts of the archipelago without due process of law. Like fathers Mariano Gomez, Jose Burgos, and Jacinto Zamora, Rizal was executed, a noble victim of Spanish miscarriage of justice. Something to reflect. There can be no tyrants where there are no slaves. Reference.